Hello, SPED 355. We've made it to week 9. Hope everyone had a great fall break. We're going to walk through, starting through chapter 4 this week. So we're going to be spending 2 weeks in chapter 4, and I want to walk through the slides. I posted the slides. This video is coming a little late just because of some tech issues I was having with Zoom. So if you've already looked at the slides, know that I'm going to walk through them again. So with chapter 4, I'm splitting it in not quite half for you this week. So I want to give you a good foundation before we jump into the evidence-based reading interventions. So I'm talking through evidence-based reading practices and kind of giving us a good foundation this week. And then next week, we're going to jump into the actual evidence-based reading practices and interventions specifically, and so that by name. So this week, we're going to be talking about just some vocabulary and laying our foundation. So I want to start with looking at reading abilities and how they're assessed. So I want to make sure that we understand these two vocabulary words, screening and progress monitoring, starting with screening. In many schools, universal screeners are tests that are given 1 to 3 times a year. If you've had any experience in the classroom setting, you may know that, or if you even remember from your high school days, that universal screeners were given beginning, middle, and end of the year. So reading and math, or reading math and science, or reading math, science, and writing, sometimes also social studies. So we measure at the beginning of the year, usually about 2 or 3 weeks in, sometime around the winter holiday, and then again in the spring, and so that we can measure a student's growth. Those are done to help us get data on students so that we know where they're at. In elementary, and many times in middle school, they help us see if there's any reading needs for our students, and that helps us understand if our students need those tier 1, 2, 3 interventions. Okay. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I want you to know that screening and progress monitoring are two different things. They're both pieces of data that we will use to help us move from tier 1, 2, and 3 interventions. But they're important parts of our vocabulary that we're going to be using from here on out. So next, we're looking at progress monitoring, data collected on regular scheduled intervals to assess reading progress. So if you've helped with reading interventions or participated in reading interventions, or if you've taken a class on reading interventions, you may very well understand what progress monitoring is. It can happen in math as well, writing as well, but we are specifically talking about reading practices right now. So screening and progress monitoring. Screening is what happens typically, and we're referring it to the beginning of the year. And so it can happen really at any time of the year, but I want to really focus on screening that happens at the beginning of the year with the reading practices that are occurring. So I'm looking at evidence-based reading practices. These can include differentiated teaching strategies, which we've talked a lot about in chapters 1 through 3, research-based comprehensive reading curricula, and evidence-based reading interventions. Now, note that I titled the slide Evidence-Based Reading Practices. All the things I just talked about are the reading practices. I'm going to specifically start talking about reading interventions, which are the actual specifically named reading intervention types, different strategies that we use to support our students with reading needs. And I want to stop right here and talk about data. Data is super important. That screening piece is that first piece of data. Progress monitoring is a huge piece of data that helps us understand where students are moving. And if we need to move them from tier 1 to tier 2, tier 2 to tier 3 back to tier 2. And so that we are talking about how they are doing when we are taking data on reading interventions, and that really helps us. It tells us a story. It tells us how they're doing, what is working, what is not working, and what we need to do to help. And so if we're doing it well, then we have a lot of numbers and data to tell us, yep, this is working, or no, we need to change something. So looking at evidence-based reading interventions. So from here on out, we're going to be calling them EBIs. Schools have a lot of acronyms, so we're going to add this to it, EBIs. They're easily implemented with tier 1 reading curriculum. Now, remember, we've talked a lot about tier 1. Tier 1 happens in the general ed classroom, just like tier 2 and tier 3. But EBIs are reading interventions that can be easily implemented within a tier 1 reading curriculum. Remember, tier 1 is happening in the general ed classroom. It's the curriculum that's happening with everybody. These are not small groups that have been pulled out yet, but if the screening has happened and we're saying, ooh, these number of kids need some help, these evidence-based reading interventions can be easily implemented with the reading curriculum. Going to give you some more key terms here: evidence-based reading interventions, research-based reading programs, teaching and student strategies, foundations of reading instructions. You're going to see these 4 key terms all throughout chapter 4, not just this week, but also next week. So just keep those in mind. All right, so foundations of reading instruction. If you're going to be a teacher in Wisconsin, if you're going to be a teacher in Minnesota, if you're going to be a teacher in any other state, you're going to understand that there's foundations of reading instruction. There's been a lot of research, especially in the last 20 years, to say, hey, these are the 5 essential elements of effective reading instruction. You might hear them called something different, but I'm going to give you access to an article that really boils them down to the data that you're going to see here. There's 5 essential elements: phonological awareness, alphabetic principle, which is also phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. These are the 5 essential elements. So if somebody asks you tomorrow, what are the 5 essential elements to effective reading instruction, you can tell them. All right, so I'm going to take you through this just quickly because this is not necessarily the focus of our chapter this week, but I want you to be familiar with what these are. Phonological awareness, these are the skills that children need to identify and use specific elements of spoken language, including those phonemes, syllables, and words. It's that subset. So the phonemic awareness is that subset of phonological awareness and emphasizes the recognition of individual sounds or phonemes. So this is in that table at the beginning of chapter 4, so make sure you're familiar with that. Second piece, essential element, alphabetic principle or phonics. Some people call it alphabetic principle. Some people call it phonics. It's the same thing. So this is the understanding of sound-symbol relationship and skills for combining sounds into words. This is specifically when acquiring knowledge about the relationship between written letters and spoken sounds. Okay, this is when that happens. And these are happening, at the same time. Sometimes they're happening simultaneously. Sometimes they're happening one after the other. Okay, and then we have fluency. These are skills necessary to apply word recognition and comprehension to read quickly and accurately with expression. Fluent readers are able to collectively use these sub-skills for reading, phonemic awareness, letter naming, and sound-symbol relationships. Okay, next we move on to vocabulary. These are when words that a reader or learner acquires in communication reflects one of the 2 primary types of vocabulary. We know that there's 2 types of vocabulary, primary types: oral and reading. Okay, so much of vocabulary is acquired through daily experience with reading or being read to. That experience with being read to or being or reading something. And this is any print. Okay, this is not just sitting down and reading a book. It's like reading the back of a cereal box, that kind of thing. Other vocabulary development occurs through direct teaching instruction. So this is modeling, practice strategies. This is the stuff that you and I will do in the classroom. So just as an example, oral reading is that listening and speaking. Reading vocabulary is the print and writing. All right, and that brings us to comprehension. We know that comprehension occurs when readers understand what they are reading as they interact with the text, and it's a complex process that requires direct teaching of cognitive strategies so that students can construct meaning from written material in print. Comprehension doesn't just happen. This is what happens when all of those other pieces occur with direct teaching of cognitive strategies so that students can construct meaning from the written material. Okay, so we're building on all of those things. All right, so looking at reading interventions. When there's an issue with any one of those 5 elements, we look at reading interventions. And I'm focusing on table 4.2 here. That's why I put it in the slide. So make sure you go back and look at that in the reading. We're looking at key reading EBIs, remember that evidence-based instruction that can help meet needs in area of fluency, comprehension, vocabulary development, and also motivation. Because we know when our readers are not motivated, then that can be a big issue in helping them progress through reading. All right, so we're also looking at EBIs. These should be implemented in conjunction with Tier 1 instruction. So we're not pulling those apart. So kids should still be getting Tier 1 instruction in the classroom, just like every other kiddo in general education. We should not be separating anything. So this should all be happening along with Tier 1 instruction. Remember, Tier 1 instruction is that good instruction that happens in the general education classroom. Nothing is being separated, even in Tier 2 and Tier 3. Kiddos should still be getting good instruction in the Tier 1 setting, the general ed classroom. EBIs can be implemented in conjunction with Tier 1 instruction in the general education classroom setting, followed by the use of Tier 2 support as needed. Remember, we only move to Tier 2 if there's data that says, yep, this kiddo needs to move to Tier 2. This should be used prior to different or alternate curriculum. Remember, we can't just say, hey, I think that kid needs help, so we're going to put him in this alternate curriculum or different curriculum. We need to have data from our screening and our progress monitoring to say, this is what needs to happen next, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we move through the reading interventions, but just know that no decision should ever be made without data. No decision should ever be made because like we feel like it's a good idea. We want to make sure that our progress monitoring is very accurate and our data is very accurate. So when these evidence-based interventions are implemented with fidelity, then our tier 1 instruction is good. Then we are seeing that our kids are moving and they're making progress. That's what should happen. So now I want to talk a little bit about 2 specific types of reading evidence-based interventions before we kind of wrap up the slides for this week. Next week, I'll continue with more specific interventions, but we're going to talk about 2 this week. So reciprocal teaching. This has been around a long time, okay? You may have heard of reciprocal teaching. You may have been actually a part of reciprocal teaching, probably in middle school or high school. So for every one of these evidence-based instructions, reading instructions, I'm going to give you a primary instructional type, a primary target population, and a primary content area. So you can see on the left where I put the primary instructional type here is direct instruction. The primary target population is 6th through 9th grade, and the primary target content area is reading comprehension. So you can tell a little bit about this. We're a teacher in a small group, explore reading comprehension and use 4 comprehension strategies: questioning, summarizing, clarifying, and predicting. This addresses 4 types of comprehension skills through dialogue and collaborative groups, and this helps bring meaning to the text. So what we're doing here is we're working with middle schoolers through 9th graders. We're targeting reading comprehension through these 4 comprehension strategies, okay? And then this is, we know this is research-based evidence because it's grounded in Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, also scaffolding, also teacher-guided instruction. So just kind of wrapping up here before we move to the next one. We know that these are evidence-based because they're based in research that's been done for years and years and years. And this has been around almost 40 years, the specific one. We know that it works because we have lots of data to say that it does. And there's a ton of research. If you're interested in the research, I can show it to you or help you find it in the library. But this is research-based evidence. It's also based on very well-researched teaching strategies, like zone of proximal development, scaffolding, teaching guided instruction that we still use today. So the second intervention that we're going to talk about this week before we wrap up, again, looking at evidence-based intervention, we're going to talk about class-wide peer tutoring. This also may be something you experience maybe in middle school or high school. Again, I'm going to show you the primary instructional type. So I want you to get used to looking at that first, because when you choose these interventions for your classroom later on, when you have your own classroom and even in student teaching, you need to say, okay, what is my instructional type? What am I looking for? What grade level am I serving? What content area? Okay, so this one is cooperative. This one is for all grade levels. This one is for reading, spelling, math, and social studies. So if you're looking for something for science, this would not be the one that you need. Okay, so I want you to start looking at those specifically. And if you read further into chapter 4, if you read ahead this week, that's fine. You'll start noticing that there's different ones. Okay, so class-wide peer tutoring. Reciprocal peer tutoring is a game time format where you have a dyad that accumulates points for friendly competition. So like you have a weekly setting. There's two sets of students. Students are trained as tutors and tutees and how they ask specific questions, how to correct mistakes. It's very specific, how to award points, how to provide feedback. The primary goal here is to activate prior knowledge, actively engage students in learning, and increase motivation. So we know it's research-based because it's been shown to affect reading comprehension and fluency. It increases academic engagement and academic achievement. It's grounded in 8 constructs needed to effectively teach students, and you can see those here. These are research-based. These are proven. They've been around for 40, 50, many decades. And so we know that this is research-based evidence. That's why it's important that we know that there's research and data behind it so that we know that it works. All right, so that's enough slides for this week. If you have any questions about the specific learning disability quiz or the discussion or any of your projects, please don't hesitate to reach out. We are going to be wrapping up in just a short, about 6.5 weeks now. So email me sooner rather than later so that you have time. And I hope everyone has a great week. Thanks so much.